Chapter 37 of the Adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom by Tobias Smollett. This recording is in the public domain. The reader may have observed that Fathom, with all his circumspection, had a weak side, which exposed him to sundry mischances. This was his covetousness, which on some occasions became too hard for his discretion. At this period of time, it was, by the circumstances of his situation, inflamed to a degree of rapacity. He was now prevailed upon to take a hand at whist or piquet, and even to wield the hazard box, though he had hitherto declared himself an irreconcilable enemy to all sorts of play; and so uncommon was his success and dexterity at these exercises, as to surprise his acquaintance, and arouse the suspicion of some people, who repined at his prosperity. But in nothing was his conduct more inexcusable than in giving way to the dangerous temerity of Ratchcali, which he had always been at pains to restrain, and permitting him to practise the same fraud upon an English nobleman, which had been executed upon himself at Frankfort. In other words, the Tyrolese, by the canal of Ferdinand's finger and recommendation, sold a pebble for a real brilliant; and in a few days the cheat was discovered, to the infinite confusion of our adventurer, who nevertheless assumed the guise of innocence with so much art, and expressed such indignation against the villain who had imposed upon his judgment and unsuspecting generosity, that his lordship acquitted him of any share in the deceit, and contented himself with the restitution, which he insisted upon making out of his own pocket, until he should be able to apprehend the rogue, who had thought proper to abscond for his own safety. In spite of all this exculpation, his character did not fail to retain a sort of stigma, which indeed the plainest proofs of innocence are hardly able to efface; and his connection with such a palpable knave as the Tyrolese appeared to be, had an effect to his prejudice in the minds of all those who were privy to the occurrence. When a man's reputation is once brought in question, every trifle is, by the malevolence of mankind, magnified into a strong presumption against the culprit. A few whispers communicated by the envious mouth of slander, which he can have no opportunity to answer and refute, shall, in the opinion of the world, convict him of the most horrid crimes; and for one hypocrite who is decked with the honours of virtue, there are 20 good men who suffer the ignominy of vice. So well disposed are individuals to trample upon the fame of their fellow creatures. If the most unblemished merit is not protected from this injustice, it will not be wondered at that no quarter was given to the character of an adventurer like Fathom, who, among other unlucky occurrences, had the misfortune to be recognised about this time by his two Parisian friends, Sir Stentor Stile and Sir Giles Squirrel. These worthy knights errant had returned to their own country after having made a very prosperous campaign in France, at the end of which, however, they very narrowly escaped the galleys; and seeing the Polish Count seated at the head of taste and politeness, they immediately circulated the story of his defeat at Paris, with many ludicrous circumstances of their own invention, and did not scruple to affirm that he was a rank impostor. When the laugh is raised upon a great man, he never fails to dwindle into contempt. Ferdinand began to perceive a change in the countenance of his friends. His company was no longer solicited with that eagerness which they had formerly expressed in his behalf. Even his entertainments were neglected. When he appeared at any private or public assembly, the ladies, instead of glowing with pleasure, as formerly, now tittered or regarded him with looks of disdain; and a certain pert little forward coquette, with a view to put him out of countenance, by raising the laugh at his expense, asked him one night, at a drum, when he had heard from his relations in Poland. She succeeded in her design upon the mirth of the audience, but was disappointed in the other part of her aim; for our hero replied, without the least mark of discomposure, "They are all in good health at your service, madam. I wish I knew in what part of the world your relations reside, that I might return the compliment." By this answer, which was the more severe, as the young lady was of very doubtful extraction, he retorted the laugh upon the aggressor, though he likewise failed in his attempt upon her temper; for she was perhaps the only person present who equalled himself in stability of countenance. Notwithstanding this appearance of unconcern, he was deeply touched with these marks of alienation in the behaviour of his friends, and, foreseeing in his own disgrace the total shipwreck of his fortune, he entered into a melancholy deliberation with himself about the means of retrieving his importance in the beau monde, or of turning his address into some other channel, where he could stand upon a less slippery foundation. In this exercise of his thoughts, no scheme occurred more feasible than that of securing the booty he had made, and retiring with his associate, who was also blown, into some other country, where their names and characters being unknown, they might pursue their old plan of commerce without molestation. He imparted this suggestion to the Tyrolese, who approved the proposal of decamping, though he combated with all his might our hero's inclination to withdraw himself before the trial, by repeating the assurances of the solicitor, who told him he might depend upon being reimbursed by the sentence of the court for a great part of the sums he had expended in the course of the prosecution. Fathom suffered himself to be persuaded by these arguments, supported with the desire of making an honourable retreat, and, waiting patiently for the day of trouble, discharged his sureties by a personal appearance in court. Yet this was not the only score he discharged that morning. The solicitor presented his own bill before they set out for Westminster Hall, and gave the Count to understand that it was the custom, from time immemorial, for the client to clear with his attorney before trial. Ferdinand had nothing to object against this established rule, though he looked upon it as a bad omen, in spite of all the solicitor's confidence and protestations, and he was not a little confounded, when, looking into the contents, he found himself charged with 350 attendances. He knew it was not in his interest to disoblige his lawyer at such a juncture; nevertheless, he could not help expostulating with him on this article, which seemed to be so falsely stated with regard to the number. When his questions drew on an explanation, by which he found he had incurred the penalty of 3 shillings and 4pence for every time he chanced to meet the conscientious attorney, either in the park, the coffee house, or the street, provided they had exchanged the common salutation, and he had good reason to believe the solicitor had often thrown himself in his way, with a view to swell this item of his account. With this extortion our adventurer was fain to comply, because he lay at the mercy of the caitiff. Accordingly, he with good grace paid the demand, which, including his former disbursements, amounted to £365, 11 shillings and 3pence 3 farthings, and then, presenting himself before the judge, quietly submitted to the laws of the realm. His counsel behaved like men of consummate abilities in their profession. They exerted themselves with equal industry, eloquence, and erudition, in their endeavours to perplex the truth, browbeat the evidence, puzzle the judge, and mislead the jury. But the defendant found himself woefully disappointed in the deposition of Trapwell's journeyman, whom the solicitor pretended to have converted to his interest. This witness, as the attorney afterwards declared, played booty, and the facts came out so clear, that Ferdinand Count Fathom was convicted of criminal conversation with the plaintiff's wife, and cast in £1,500, under the denomination of damages. He was not so much surprised as afflicted at this decision, because he saw it gradually approaching from the examination of the first evidence. His thoughts were now employed in casting about for some method of deliverance from the snare in which he found himself entangled. To escape, he foresaw it would be impracticable, as Trapwell would undoubtedly be prepared for arresting him before he could quit Westminster Hall. He was too well acquainted with Ratchcali's principles to expect any assistance from that quarter in money matters, and he was utterly averse to the payment of the sum awarded against him, which would have exhausted his whole fortune. He therefore resolved to try the friendship of some persons of fashion, with whom he had maintained an intimacy of correspondence. Should they fail him in the day of his necessity, he proposed to have recourse to his former sureties, one of whom he meant to bilk, while the other might accompany him in his retreat; or, should both these expedients miscarry, he determined, rather than part with his effects, to undergo the most disagreeable confinement, in hope of obtaining the jailor's connivance at his escape. These resolutions being taken, he met his fate with great fortitude and equanimity, and calmly suffered himself to be conveyed to the house of a sheriff's officer, who, as he made his exit from the hall, according to his own expectation, executed a writ against him, at the suit of Trapwell, for a debt of £2,000. To this place he was followed by his solicitor, who was allured by the prospect of another job, and who, with great demonstrations of satisfaction, congratulated him upon the happy issue of the trial, arrogating to himself the merit of having saved him £8,000 in the article of damages, by the previous steps he had taken, and the noble defence that he and his friends the counsel had made for their client. He even hinted an expectation of receiving a gratuity for his extraordinary care and discretion. Fathom, galled as he was with his misfortune, and enraged at the effrontery of this pettifogger, maintained a serenity of countenance, and sent the attorney with a message to the plaintiff, importing that, as he was a foreigner, and could not be supposed to have so much cash about him as to spare £1,500 from the funds of his ordinary expense, he would grant him a bond payable in 2 months, during which period he should be able to procure a proper remittance from his own estate. While the solicitor was employed in this negotiation, he dispatched his valet de chambre to one nobleman, and Maurice to another, with billets signifying the nature of the verdict which his adversary had obtained, and desiring that each would lend him £1,000 upon his parole, until he could negotiate bills upon the continent. His 3 messengers returned almost at the same instant of time, and these were the answers they brought back. Trapwell absolutely rejected his personal security, and threatened him with all the horrors of a jail, unless he would immediately discharge the debt, or procure sufficient bondsmen; and one of his quality friends favoured him with this reply to his request: "My dear Count, I am mortally chagrined at the triumph you have furnished to that rascally citizen. By the Lord, the judge must have been in the terrors of cuckoldom to influence the decision, and the jury a mere herd of horned beasts to bring in such a barbarous verdict. Egad! At this rate, no gentleman will be able to lie with another man's wife but at the risk of a cursed prosecution. But to waive this disagreeable circumstance, which you must strive to forget, I declare my mortification is still the greater, because I cannot at present supply you with the trifle your present exigency requires. For to tell you a secret, my own finances are in damnable confusion, but a man of Count Fathom's figure and address can never be puzzled for the want of such a paltry sum. Adieu, my dear Count. We shall, I suppose, have the pleasure of seeing you to-morrow at White's. Meanwhile, I have the honour to be, with the most perfect attachment, yours, Grizzlegrin." The other noble peer, to whom he addressed himself on this occasion, cherished the same sentiments of virtue, friendship, and generosity, but his expression was so different, that we shall, for the edification of the reader, transcribe his letter in his own words. "Sir, I was never more astonished at the receipt of your very extraordinary billet, wherein you solicit the loan of £1,000, which you desire may be sent with the bearer on faith of your parole. Sir, I have no money to send you or lend you, and cannot help repeating my expressions of surprise at your confidence in making such a strange and unwarranted demand. 'Tis true, I may have made professions of friendship, while I looked upon you as a person of honour and good morals; but now that you are convicted of such a flagrant violation of the laws of that kingdom where you have been treated with such hospitality and respect, I think myself fully absolved from any such conditional promise, which indeed is never interpreted into any other than a bare compliment. I am sorry you have involved your character and fortune in such a disagreeable affair, and am, sir, yours, etc., Troppington." Ferdinand was not so much a novice in the world as to be disappointed at these repulses, especially as he had laid very little stress upon the application, which was made by way of an experiment upon the gratitude or caprice of those 2 noblemen, whom he had actually more than once obliged with the same sort of assistance which he now solicited, though not to such a considerable amount. Having nothing further to expect from the fashionable world, he sent the Tyrolese to the person who had been bail for his appearance, with full instructions to explain his present occasion in the most favourable light, and desire he would reinforce the credit of the Count with his security. But that gentleman, though he placed the most perfect confidence on the honour of our hero, and would have willingly entered into bonds again for his personal appearance, was not quite so well satisfied of his circumstances as to become liable for the payment of £2,000, an expense which, in his opinion, the finances of no foreign count were able to defray. He therefore lent a deaf ear to the most pressing remonstrances of the ambassador, who had recourse to several other merchants, with the same bad success; so that the prisoner, despairing of bail, endeavoured to persuade Ratchcali that it would be his interest to contribute £1,000 towards his discharge, that he might be enabled to quit England with a good grace, and execute his part of the plan they had projected. So powerful was his eloquence on the occasion, and such strength of argument did he use, that even the Tyrolese seemed convinced, though reluctantly, and agreed to advance the necessary sum upon the bond and judgment of our adventurer, who, being disabled from transacting his own affairs in person, was obliged to entrust Ratchcali with his keys, papers, and power of attorney, under the check and inspection of his faithful Maurice and the solicitor, whose fidelity he bespoke with the promise of an ample recompense. Chapter 37.